Blood stained the pristine trauma bay floors as the chief of medicine screamed, "Nurses don't give orders in my hospital." He was ready to destroy her career on the spot. But seconds later, a secure line from the Pentagon rang, and the absolute last person they asked for was him. Fluorescent lights buzzed mercilessly overhead in the emergency department of Washington Presbyterian Hospital. Friday nights in the nation's capital were notoriously brutal, but tonight carried an electric, suffocating tension that seemed to cling to the sterile walls. Sarah Jenkins stood at the center of the chaos, wiping a smear of sweat from her forehead with the back of a gloved hand. At 42, Sarah was a veteran of the medical trenches. Before trading her combat boots for hospital clogs, she had spent a decade as an Army medic, serving 3 tours in environments where hesitation meant death. She knew trauma intimately, recognizing the subtle, terrible languages the human body spoke when it was on the verge of giving up. Dr. Arthur Penhaligon, however, spoke a different language entirely. As the chief of trauma surgery, Penhaligon was a man carved from pure Ivy League marble. He had impeccable credentials, a towering ego, and a profound disdain for anyone who challenged his authority. In Penhaligon's world, doctors were gods, and nurses were merely the hands that fetched their instruments. He had never seen a battlefield, never had to triage a patient under mortar fire, and never learned the absolute necessity of trusting the seasoned nurses standing beside him. The double doors of the ambulance bay blew open with a violent crash. Rain and freezing wind swept into the trauma bay alongside 2 breathless paramedics. They were wheeling in a stretcher, holding a massive unconscious man. There was no wallet, no phone, no identification. Just a John Doe in a torn, unmarked tactical jacket, drenched in a mixture of rain and his own fluids. "What do we have?" Penhaligon demanded, striding into Trauma Room 1 with the crisp, unhurried pace of a man who believed the world revolved around his schedule. Unknown male, maybe late 30s, the lead paramedic panted, shifting the gurney into the locking mechanism. Found unresponsive in an alley 2 blocks from DuPont Circle. Severe respiratory distress, dropping oxygen saturations and unusual rigidity in his extremities. We suspect a massive opioid overdose combined with some kind of blunt force trauma to the chest. Sarah immediately moved to the patient's opposite side, her trained eyes scanning the man's body. Something was inherently wrong. The narrative didn't fit the presentation. While Penhaligon ordered a standard trauma panel and began barking instructions at the junior residents, Sarah noticed the patient's skin. It wasn't the pale, clammy gray of a typical fentanyl overdose. There was a faint, almost imperceptible bluish mottling creeping up his neck, and his pupils were pinned down to the size of needle points. "Let's get him intubated now." Penhaligon ordered, snapping his fingers at Rachel, a 23-year-old junior nurse who was already trembling under the chief's harsh gaze. "Push 2 milligrams of Narcan, then give me 20 of etomidate and 100 of succinylcholine. We need to secure that airway before he codes." Rachel scrambled to the medication cart, her hands shaking as she began to draw up the powerful paralytic succinylcholine. Sarah leaned closer to the patient. A faint, sickeningly sweet odor wafted from his skin like burnt almonds mixed with raw copper. Her blood ran ice cold. She grabbed the collar of the man's torn jacket and pulled it down, revealing a highly specific, classified tattoo on his collarbone, a faded spear interwoven with a constellation. But it was the localized, blistered rash over his carotid artery that confirmed her darkest fear. This was not an overdose. This was chemical exposure, specifically a military-grade synthetic neurotoxin derivative, something Sarah had only seen once during a classified extraction near the Syrian border. If Rachel pushed succinylcholine, a paralytic that acted on the neuromuscular junctions, it would create a catastrophic, irreversible reaction with the neurotoxin already ravaging the man's nervous system. His heart would literally tear itself apart within 30 seconds. "Stop!" Sarah's voice cut through the clamor of the trauma bay like a gunshot. The entire room froze. The rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Rachel stopped the syringe hovering inches from the patient's IV port, looking terrified. Penhaligon slowly turned his head, his eyes narrowing into venomous slits. "Excuse me, Nurse Jenkins, did you just interrupt my code?" "He's not overdosing on opioids, Dr. Penhaligon," Sarah said, her voice remarkably steady, despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Look at the localized blistering on his neck. Smell the air around him. Look at the pinpoint pupils paired with hypersalivation. This is organophosphate toxicity, likely a weaponized nerve agent. If you push succinylcholine, you will kill him instantly." Penhaligon's face flushed a deep, furious crimson. "Are you out of your mind? You're diagnosing chemical warfare in downtown DC based on a rash and a smell. He's a junkie who got into a bad batch. Rachel, push the meds. Now." "Rachel, do not push those medications," Sarah commanded, her tone carrying the absolute, uncompromising weight of a former staff sergeant. She locked eyes with the junior nurse. "Step away from the line," Rachel whimpered, completely paralyzed by the conflicting orders. Penhaligon took a step toward Sarah, his physical presence looming and threatening. "You are a nurse, Jenkins. You do not diagnose, and you absolutely do not override my directives. I am the chief of medicine here, Fatir Nartik Benta, and you are about to murder this patient," Sarah shot back, refusing to yield a single inch. "He needs atropine and pralidoxime, massive doses right now. If we intubate him with a standard paralytic, he goes into cardiac arrest, and we will not get him back." The patient suddenly seized his back, arching violently off the bloody gurney. The monitor shrieked as his heart rate plummeted. Time had run out. "Push the succinylcholine," Penhaligon roared. "Rachel, put the syringe down," Sarah yelled. "Nurses don't give orders," the chief yelled, his voice cracking with unhinged rage. "I will have your license for this, Jenkins. I will see you destroyed." Chaos erupted. Ignoring the screaming chief of surgery, Sarah shoved her way around the gurney. Rachel, sobbing from the stress, dropped the syringe of paralytic onto the sterile tray and backed against the wall. Penhaligon lunged forward to grab the medication himself, but Sarah was faster. She used her shoulder to physically box the doctor out of the way, a tactical maneuver learned in combat zones. "Security, get security in here!" Penhaligon bellowed, his face contorted in absolute fury. Ignoring him completely, Sarah ripped open the crash cart's bottom drawer, bypassing the standard trauma drugs. Her hands flew with practiced mechanical precision. She grabbed 3 vials of atropine and a pre-mixed auto-injector of pralidoxime chloride. She didn't bother drawing it up gently. She slammed the atropine directly into the patient's main IV line and plunged the auto-injector straight into his outer thigh muscle. "What the hell are you doing?" Penhaligon screamed, his hands hovering, as if he wanted to physically strangle her, but was restrained by the sheer shock of her insubordination. "You are injecting unapproved antidotes into my patient," "You're finished, Jenkins. You hear me? Finished." For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The cardiac monitor continued its terrifying, jagged descent into bradycardia. The patient's face was turning a dreadful shade of purple. Penhaligon glared at the screen, a triumphant, cruel sneer forming on his lips. "You just killed him. You killed him, and you are going to prison." But then the jagged lines on the monitor shifted. The agonizingly slow beep, beep began to accelerate. Beep, beep, beep. The violent tremors racking the John Doe's body subsided. His oxygen saturations, previously plummeting into the fatal 60s, halted, shuddered, and began to climb back into the 80s. The bluish tint on his face slowly yielded to a deathly pale but undeniable pink. He was stabilizing. Sarah exhaled a long, shaking breath, her hands resting on the cold steel rails of the gurney. She had bought him time. The trauma bay doors swung open and 2 massive hospital security guards rushed in. "Get her out of here," Penhaligon ordered, his voice dripping with absolute venom. The fact that the patient was alive didn't matter. The fact that Sarah had been right didn't matter. She had humiliated him in front of his staff. "Nurse Jenkins is suspended effective immediately. Escort her to her locker to collect her things, and then throw her off hospital property. If she resists, call the police." Sarah didn't fight. The adrenaline was leaving her system, replaced by a heavy, hollow exhaustion. She looked at Rachel, who was weeping silently, and then at the patient, who was now stable enough to be safely intubated with non-depolarizing agents. "His atropine drip needs to be maintained," Sarah said quietly to the remaining trauma team, ignoring the chief entirely. "Watch his secretions." "Get out," Penhaligon roared. Escorted by the deeply uncomfortable guards, Sarah walked the long, fluorescent-lit hallway to the staff locker room. The reality of what she had just done was crashing down on her. She had assaulted a chief of surgery stolen medication and administered it without a physician's order. Penhaligon wasn't just going to fire her. He was going to report her to the state nursing board. Her career of 20 years was over. She stripped off her bloody scrubs, changed into her civilian jeans and a heavy wool coat, and threw her stethoscope into her duffel bag. It felt like burying a piece of her soul. Meanwhile, back in trauma room, one Penhaligon was proudly writing his notes. He had taken complete control of the stabilized patient, dictating a narrative to the residents that miraculously framed the recovery as a result of his swift, dynamic leadership. He was just finishing his chart when the hospital's ambient noise abruptly changed. The wailing sirens of approaching ambulances were suddenly drowned out by the heavy rhythmic thumping of helicopter blades vibrating the glass windows of the ER. Outside in the ambulance bay, 4 matte black SUVs slammed to a halt, blocking all incoming traffic. Heavily armed military police in tactical gear poured out, instantly securing the perimeter of the hospital. The ER doors slid open, and a contingent of men in dark suits and military dress uniforms marched into the lobby. At the front was General Thomas Cavanaugh. His face was a map of hard lines and deeply kept secrets. He bypassed the triage desk completely, his security detail physically moving hospital administrators out of his path. Who was the attending physician in charge of the John Doe admitted 12 minutes ago? Cavanaugh's voice didn't just ask a question. It demanded immediate capitulation. Penhaligon, sensing an opportunity to showcase his brilliance to high-level VIPs, stepped out of the trauma bay, adjusting his white coat. "That would be me. I am Dr. Arthur Penhaligon, Chief of Surgery. Are you here for my patient? Because I must warn you, It was a highly complex chemical toxicity case, but I managed to stabilize him. Kavanaugh's cold eyes swept over the arrogant doctor. He snatched the medical chart from the nurse's station and scanned the medications administered. The general's eyes narrowed. You diagnosed exposure to compound VX7 and administered a massive unprompted dose of atropine and pralidoxim. Penhaligon puffed out his chest. Yes, General. It was a difficult call, but my expertise in unusual traumas— Bullshit! Kavanaugh interrupted his voice, dropping to a terrifying quiet register. VX7 is a classified experimental nerve agent. Its symptoms mimic opioid overdose perfectly, unless you know exactly what to look for. And there are exactly 0 civilian doctors in this city trained to recognize it, let alone immediately deploy the correct counteragent while under pressure. Penhaligon faltered his arrogant smirk, melting into a look of absolute panic. I oversaw the room, General. It was a team effort. I don't have time for your ego, Doctor, Kavanaugh barked. The general turned to the terrified staff gathered around the nurse's station. The person who saved this operative's life possesses highly specialized forward combat medical knowledge. I need to speak to them right now. Where is the person who actually pushed these drugs? Rachel, still wiping tears from her cheeks, stepped forward timidly. It was Nurse Jenkins, sir, Sarah Jenkins, but Dr. Penhaligon just fired her. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. General Kavanaugh slowly turned his gaze back to the chief of surgery. You fired the only person in this building competent enough to save my best operative. Before Penhaligon could stammer an excuse, Kavanaugh turned to his aide. Lock down the exits. Find Nurse Sarah Jenkins. Do not let her leave this perimeter. Rain slashed violently against the concrete of the employee parking garage, mirroring the chaotic storm raging inside Sarah's mind. She clutched her duffel bag tightly, her knuckles white as the 2 hospital security guards trailed her with uncomfortable heavy footsteps. 20 years of saving lives, of holding the fragile line between life and death, erased in a single moment of arrogant, administrative fury. She was halfway to her beaten-up Honda Civic when the screech of heavy tires echoed through the concrete structure. 2 matte black tactical SUVs swerved into the aisle, their blinding high beams pinning Sarah against the harsh lighting of the garage. The doors flew open before the vehicles even fully halted. 4 soldiers dressed in full tactical gear weapons slung across their chests fanned out instantly, establishing a secure perimeter. The hospital security guards, completely out of their depth, stumbled backward, raising their hands in silent surrender. A tall man in a tailored dark suit stepped out of the lead vehicle. He held an earpiece tight to his ear, his eyes scanning Sarah from head to toe. Sarah Jenkins, he asked, his voice cutting through the drumming rain. Former Staff Sergeant 101st Airborne Division. Sarah instinctively straightened her posture, the deep-rooted military discipline overriding her exhaustion. I am. Who is asking? Special Agent Miller, Department of Defense, the man replied, flashing a pair of federal credentials that gleamed under the garage lights. General Thomas Kavanaugh requests your immediate presence back in Trauma Room 1. We have a highly fluid classified situation, and you are currently the only medical personnel in this sector cleared and competent to handle it. Sarah let out a harsh, humorless laugh, shaking her head as the freezing rain soaked her hair. You're about 10 minutes too late, Agent Miller. I was just terminated by the chief of surgery. I don't have medical privileges in that building anymore. If I walk back in there, Dr. Penhaligon will have me arrested for trespassing. Agent Miller didn't smile, but a dangerous, cold amusement flickered in his eyes. He gestured toward the open door of the SUV. Ma'am, with all due respect, Dr. Penhaligon's authority ended the second General Kavanaugh stepped off his helicopter. The hospital is now under federal lockdown. Your country needs you back inside. Minutes later, Sarah walked back through the sliding doors of the emergency department, flanked by federal agents. The transformation of the ER was absolute. Washington Presbyterian Hospital's typical Friday night chaos had been replaced by a chilling, hyper-organized military occupation. Nurses and doctors were clustered behind the administrative desks, watching in stunned silence as heavily armed military police guarded every exit and hallway. At the center of the storm stood General Thomas Kavanaugh. He was currently dressing down Richard Gable, the hospital's chief executive officer, who had been pulled from a high society charity dinner and was sweating profusely in his expensive tuxedo. Dr. Arthur Penhaligon stood beside the CEO, looking like a man who had just swallowed glass. General, I must protest this hostile takeover of a civilian medical facility, Gable stammered, adjusting his bow tie nervously. Dr. Penhaligon is one of the most respected trauma surgeons on the East Coast. Whatever your operative needs, I assure you, Arthur is more than capable. Mr. Gable. Kavanaugh interrupted his voice, a low, terrifying rumble that silenced the entire room. Your chief of surgery nearly assassinated my best intelligence officer with a paralyzing agent because he was too arrogant to recognize a weaponized organophosphate. If it wasn't for the nurse he just fired, you would be explaining to the President of the United States why a domestic terror cell just successfully eliminated a federal agent in your hospital. Penhaligon's face drained of all color. He looked as if the floor had completely dropped out from beneath him. General, you will remain silent. Dr. Kavanaugh snapped, not even bothering to look at him. He turned his attention to the corridor as Sarah was escorted into the lobby. The general's hard expression softened marginally, replaced by a look of deep professional respect. He stepped away from the administrators and offered his hand. Staff Sergeant Jenkins, it is an honor to meet you. I'm General Kavanaugh. Sarah shook his hand firmly, ignoring the shocked gasps of her former colleagues. Just Nurse Jenkins, now General. What is the status of your man, Agent Liam Hayes? Kavanaugh said, lowering his voice as he guided Sarah back toward Trauma Room 1. He was tracking a splinter faction that managed to steal a highly unstable experimental nerve, Agent VX7, from a secure testing facility at Fort Detrick. Hayes was compromised during surveillance. They hit him with a concentrated aerosolized dose and dumped him in an alley to send a message. Sarah glanced through the glass doors of the trauma bay. Liam Hayes was intubated, his chest rising and falling rhythmically with the ventilator. However, the military medical monitors attached to him were flashing yellow warnings. The atropine and pralidoxim you pushed saved his central nervous system from immediate collapse. Kavanaugh continued, his tone turning grim. But VX7 has a secondary bonding phase. It sequesters in the lipid tissues and slowly releases back into the bloodstream. Our biodefense medical team is trapped in a holding pattern over Andrews Air Force Base due to the storm. We have roughly 30 minutes before the secondary wave hits his heart. Penhaligon clearly doesn't know how to run a lipid emulsion protocol for synthetic nerve agents. Do you? Sarah stopped at the doors of the trauma bay. She looked at Dr. Penhaligon, who was watching her with a mixture of absolute hatred and profound humiliation. Then she looked at Rachel, the young junior nurse, who was standing quietly in the corner, clutching a clipboard like a shield. "I know the protocol, General," Sarah said, shrugging off her heavy wool coat and tossing it onto a nearby chair. "But I'm going to need full autonomy in that room. No administrative interference, no second guessing, and absolutely no input from the chief of surgery. You have tactical command of this medical theater," Jenkins Kavanaugh declared loudly, ensuring every administrator and doctor in the lobby heard him clearly. "Anyone who disobeys your directives answers directly to the Department of Defense." Sarah pushed open the doors to the trauma bay, the sterile scent of antiseptic washing over her. She pointed directly at the trembling junior nurse. "Rachel, get an isolation gown on. I need you on the crash cart. We are going to save this man's life, and we are going to do it my way." Alarm sliced through the tense silence of Trauma Room 1. Agent Liam Hayes' cardiac monitor, which had been holding steady, suddenly erupted in a frantic, irregular rhythm. The green line spiked and dipped erratically. Ventricular tachycardia. The secondary wave of the VX7 nerve agent was dumping from his lipid tissues back into his bloodstream, ruthlessly attacking his myocardium. "He's crashing!" Rachel yelled. Her voice panicked, but her hands steady as she gripped the handle of the crash cart. Outside the glass, Dr. Penhaligon slammed his hands against the door, his ego unable to handle being sidelined during a critical code. "He needs amiodarone. Push 300 milligrams of amiodarone immediately, or his heart will give out." He screamed through the glass, his face pressed against the pane. Sarah didn't even glance at him. Amiodarone was the standard textbook response for VTAC, but administering it to a heart poisoned by VX7 would cause a massive, irreversible electrical block. Penhaligon was once again relying on a textbook that didn't apply to the battlefield. "Ignore him, Rachel," Sarah commanded, stepping up to the head of the bed. Her voice was an anchor in the storm, perfectly calm and incredibly precise. "His myocardial cells are starved of energy because the toxin is blocking cellular respiration. We need to create an alternative energy sink. I need a 20% intralipid emulsion. Draw up a bolus of 1.5 milliliters per kilogram and set up an infusion pump. Right now." Rachel didn't hesitate. The young nurse, previously paralyzed by the chief's bullying, moved with incredible speed, empowered by Sarah's absolute confidence. She snatched the heavy milky white bags of lipid emulsion from the emergency military stockpile Kavanaugh's men had brought in. "Bolus is drawn," Rachel confirmed, holding up the massive syringe. "Push it through the central line." "Fast," Sarah ordered simultaneously, adjusting the ventilator settings to hyperoxygenate Hayes' struggling lungs. "And prepare to hang the continuous drip at 0.25 milliliters per kilogram per minute." Outside CEO. Richard Gable watched in horrified fascination as the nurse he technically employed orchestrated a highly classified complex biochemical resuscitation while his chief of surgery banged uselessly on the glass. General Kavanaugh stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on Sarah's hands, trusting the veteran completely. The milky fluid rushed into Hayes' central venous catheter. For 10 agonizing silent seconds, the monitor continued to scream. The erratic, dangerous spikes of VTAC threatened to devolve into a flat line. Sarah kept her fingers pressed firmly against the carotid artery in his neck, feeling the chaotic, desperate fluttering of his pulse. Hold on, she thought, closing her eyes for a brief second. Fight it, soldier. Slowly, almost miraculously, the rhythm began to shift. The intralipid emulsion acted like a microscopic sponge moving through the bloodstream and binding to the highly lipophilic VX7 molecules, ripping them away from the heart's electrical pathways. The jagged, terrifying spikes on the monitor rounded out, slowing down until they settled into a fast but entirely normal sinus tachycardia. Blood pressure is rebounding. Rachel reported, a massive smile breaking through her terrified expression. 110/70. Oxygen saturation is climbing to 98%. Sarah let out a slow, controlled breath, her shoulders finally dropping. Good work, Rachel. Maintain the lipid drip and keep his atropine baseline steady. We've neutralized the secondary wave. A heavy collective sigh of relief seemed to wash over the military personnel stationed outside the room. General Kavanaugh pushed open the glass doors, stepping into the trauma bay with a look of profound gratitude. Status, Jenkins. He's stable, General. Sarah wiped a fresh bead of sweat from her brow. The lipid emulsion successfully sequestered the remaining toxin. He's going to need intense ICU monitoring for the next 48 hours, but the immediate threat of cardiac collapse is over. He will survive. Kavanaugh walked to the side of the bed, looking down at his operative. Then he turned to Sarah. The biodefense unit is landing on the roof in 5 minutes. They will take over his transport to Walter Reed. You did exactly what I expected you to do, Staff Sergeant. As the military medical team arrived to secure Hayes for transport, Sarah finally stepped out of the trauma bay. The lobby was dead silent. Dr. Arthur Penhaligon stood near the nurse's station, his earlier rage entirely replaced by the hollow, terrifying realization that his career was effectively over. Richard Gable, the hospital CEO, stepped forward, clearing his throat awkwardly. Nurse Jenkins, Sarah, I want to personally apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. Dr. Penhaligon's actions were unauthorized and highly inappropriate. Your job is, of course, entirely secure, and we would like to discuss a substantial promotion to head of emergency nursing. Save it, Gable. General Kavanaugh cut in, stepping protectively to Sarah's side. He fixed the CEO with a glare that could melt steel. This hospital does not deserve a medical professional of her caliber. Furthermore, the Department of Defense will be launching a full investigation into Dr. Penhaligon's gross medical negligence and his attempt to cover up a lethal misdiagnosis. I suggest you find yourself a new chief of surgery before the federal indictments are unsealed. Penhaligon slumped against the counter, burying his face in his hands as the reality of federal prison loomed over his shattered ego. Kavanaugh turned to Sarah, a genuine warm smile finally breaking his hardened features. Washington Presbyterian is clearly blind to the talent they have. I am currently assembling a specialized rapid response medical task force at the Pentagon. We need people who don't panic, who know combat medicine, and who aren't afraid to challenge an arrogant doctor when a life is on the line. I want you as my civilian lead, Jenkins. Name your salary. Sarah looked around the emergency room. She looked at the polished floors, the terrified administrators, and the broken chief of surgery. Then she looked at the general, feeling a fire ignite in her chest that she hadn't felt since her days in the airborne. She picked up her stethoscope from her duffel bag and draped it proudly around her neck. When do I start, General? Did Sarah's bold move just save the nation from a catastrophic threat? Or will the hospital's toxic hierarchy drag her down? True heroes don't wear capes. They wear scrubs and refuse to back down when lives are on the line. If you loved this intense real-life medical drama, make sure to hit that like button, share this story with the unsung heroes in your life, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the explosive final chapters.